1985. The ambush at Sheridan Springs. In the new year, the hobby trade press salivated over rumors of TSR's impending demise. Different Worlds reported that Kezim Bloom was out as president. It went on to gossip. The company is up for sale, asking price $6 million and dropping. Their magazine, The Dragon, is also for sale at $1 million. Lorimar, Norman Lear's production company, is interested in TSR if Gary Gygax stays to run the company. Gygax, however, dismissed these reports as absolutely untrue. We are looking for an investor willing to acquire an interest in the company. Lorimar Productions wants to option properties. We're working on the options. Gygax had lined up potential investors by the beginning of February. More rumors swirled after TSR public relations staff announced that a Beverly Hills investment group had filed a letter of intent to acquire a major position in TSR Incorporated. Though TSR concealed the identity of this bidder, even within the company there was considerable secrecy about this consortium, whom they internally called the Foreman Group. But no plan to steady TSR could work without resolving the lingering question of the Blooms and their ownership position. Following Kevin's removal as president, the board attempted to negotiate a severance agreement with both Blooms, but the brothers made acceptance of any such agreement contingent on the buyback of their stock. Otherwise, they reasoned, they must remain active in the company to protect their investment. Holding nearly half of TSR shares, their family could not be ignored. The obvious way for an investor to acquire a major position in TSR would thus be through buying out the Blooms, which is exactly what the Foreman Group proposed to do. Under their plan, the Blooms would depart and Gygax would continue as an officer at the company at his current level of compensation for the next 5 years. There was just one hitch. The control provisions in TSR shareholder agreement precluded selling stock to an outsider, in keeping with Gygax's vow of a decade ago. To satisfy the Foreman Group, the company would need to amend its shareholder agreement to abolish the preemptive right of majority shareholders to purchase stock pro rata, thereby opening the door to an outside group gaining controlling interest. A special February meeting of the shareholders was then scheduled, and a resolution waiving preemptive rights passed on March 1st. It might be said that the text was excised from the document hastily in a way that might cause problems if the shareholder agreement became the object of any legal challenge. But the Foreman Group lowered their offer as they delved deeper into TSR's finances. The company's projected revenue would be down for 1985, perhaps as low as $24 million. Thus, at that same February shareholder meeting, TSR lowered the value of its stock from the 2,500 set last November to just 300. the price the foreman proposal offered the Bloom brothers and their spouses. That figure reflected recent performance and anticipated a looming crisis. It was just a tenth of the share value 6 months before, and we might recall also the maximum amount anyone thought D&D might be worth back in the beginning of 1974. And even that low stock price was contingent upon a positive resolution of the Niebling lawsuit. If Niebling won, the value of TSR shares would be diluted by an off-putting 19.5% to just $240. Incidentally, the corporate profit sharing plan, which was heavily invested in company stock, lost 75% of its value thanks to this precipitous drop, crushing any lingering morale in the employee base. TSR's humbler estimation of its own value required fresh belt tightening measures. Another round of layoffs came on March 8th. As Konings trimmed 36 more employees. It was in this round that the final remnants of the Bloom family left TSR's payroll, including Doug Bloom and Vicky Bloom. Even the eternally chipper spin doctor Dieter Sturm had to attribute the company's downsizing to a continuation of decline in sales volume. He conceded that this was possibly due to market saturation, especially as low sales of Menser's basic rules implied that the product was not attracting new customers. Module and accessory sales, however, remained strong, so TSR planned to refocus its marketing on existing hobbyists. Gygax still believed fresh D&D product would help TSR to recover. So he drove the anthologization of his recent Dragon articles into Unearthed Arcana, a book for players who had absorbed his player's handbook and wanted more. Gygax had no time to do this personally, and Frank Mentzer was understandably preoccupied with his master and immortal rules. So Gygax tapped Jeff Grubb from Mike Cook's staff to consult on the design. It was time for conciliatory gestures on Gygax's part. He invited Arneson to publish his Blackmore modules under TSR's imprint rather than pushing them through Mayfair. Under the heading, Let's Bury the Hatchet, Gygax even had some magnanimous words to say in Dragon about his longtime nemesis, the Origins Convention. After its humiliating attendance dropped the year before, Origins posed no immediate threat, so Gygax formally rescinded his 3-year-old call for a boycott on the convention, now urging gamers to support and attend all conventions, Origins, the GenCon event, and all other good events whenever and wherever they might be held. TSR generously authorized a D&D tournament at Origins. Though they would not attend as an exhibitor, it might have appeared that Gygax was tying up loose ends. In fact, he was on the cusp of taking a bold step to secure TSR, but he would set in motion a series of events that was as deterministic as the endgame on a chessboard. There were only so many moves to be made. Observers might have foreseen an inevitable conclusion. Unlike much of what transpired to date, this final battle would be little observed by the broader industry. Instead, it was fought behind closed doors of board meetings, a terrain where Gygax could be easily outflanked. It is there that we will find the conclusion of his adventure at TSR. At the end of March, TSR suddenly announced that it would be restructuring itself financially, using current resources, and that any negotiations with outside investment groups are void. This reflected the events of a board meeting on March 18th, 1985, where Gygax revealed that he had exercised his July 1976 option for 700 shares of TSR stock at a cost of 100 each. This raised his total holdings to 1,371 shares, which fell just slightly below half of outstanding TSR shares, then numbering 2,761. But the 40 shares owned by Gygax's son Ernie, when combined with his father's holdings, would suffice to secure controlling interest in TSR. I'm kind of wondering how familiar. I mean, I imagine he would be, but Jerry Holkins, uh, um, it came up a lot in the C team and also some on the main campaigns, but the Acquisitions Incorporated, a lot of the company dynamics really reminds me of the goings on in this book, but this is from 21, so the Acquisitions Incorporated stuff predates that by a while, but I'm sure there must have been other books written before this. um, I don't know, I just found that sort of interesting. Immediately, Gygax pushed to nix the Foreman deal, according to the raw notes taken by Willard Martens at that board meeting. Gygax had found a path he believed that would keep control of TSR away from outsiders. So on March 29th, the board named Gygax president and chief executive officer of TSR. In addition to his current position as chairman of the board. Koenig scheduled an all hands meeting for April 1st to report on the status generally of the company and specifically on the positive rebuilding and capital expansion efforts planned and underway. By the time they held that meeting, in the shipping area of the Torrent building, only 95 employees were left to witness the transition in leadership back to Gygax. Just a quarter of peak staffing a mere year and a half ago. As for Konings, his services were no longer required. Willard Martens would now become the board secretary in addition to his continuing the responsibilities as vice president of finance and treasurer. Martens had, at this point, wielded much of the power over corporate spending once held by the Bloom brothers. Gygax's decision to exercise his 1976 stock option might look reckless. There would be no point in owning any shares in TSR if the company collapsed for want of operating capital, and exercising these shares would turn only a modest profit considering their abrupt decline in value. But it was a 10-year option due to expire in 1986. Time was running out, and those shares might be as valuable now as they would ever be. Moreover, Gygax did not actually write TSR a check. Ever starved for liquidity, TSR owed him a far greater sum than that in royalties at the time. And Gygax merely forgave $70,000 of company debt to him in exchange for those shares. Debt that might never be paid if the company went under. If TSR would no longer seek an infusion of cash from the Foreman Group, how did Gygax plan to continue operating? The answer was that he had found someone else to invest in TSR, whom he hoped would join the company, someone Gygax had met briefly at GenCon the year before. Dun dun dun. Lorraine Williams, sister to Flint Dill, Gygax's Hollywood writing partner. Around the 1st of March, Gygax related to Dill how he was trying to find investors and potentially reorganize TSR at the time. So when Dill next spoke to Williams, he casually asked her if she had any loose change she might invest in TSR. And when she suggested she might, he urged her to call Gygax. The brief conversation that followed convinced her that was warranted a closer look, as she lived relatively close by in a Gold Coast townhouse in Chicago. Oh yeah. Huh, the descriptions of Dill didn't get off that vibe, but oh yeah, that sounds like they come from a fabulously wealthy family. In a Gold Coast townhouse in Chicago, she made the drive up to Lake Geneva a few mornings later and met with Gygax in his study at Stone Manor, where he explained the history and situation of the company. As TSR required a substantial investment, Williams wanted access to hard data about its prospects. After lunch, Gygax arranged the pair of them to visit the Sheridan Springs office to let her review the company's books, along with Konings and Martens. She sensed some wariness. TSR had courted a number of investors fruitlessly, but she won them over. At the end of the first day, she recalled that Gygax looked at her and judged, "You're impressive." Williams was about 35, and her educational background was in medieval European history rather than business. Before coming to TSR, she had worked primarily on licensing the intellectual property and trademarks associated with, oh yeah, they are related to the person who created Buck Rogers. I forgot. She had the loose change to invest in TSR because, oh, yeah, and now it's saying it outright, because she and her brother came from money. Their grandfather, John F. Dill, published the original Buck Rogers comics, and the Dill family owned the rights to the character and controlled a trust collecting the resulting royalties. The success of Star Wars had helped propel Buck Rogers back into popular culture. The Buck Rogers in the 25th Century television show, for example, had aired on NBC from 1979 to 1981. Gygax invited Williams to join TSR as a president of administration in an office letter dated April 1st, which included several stipulations relating to investment. First, Williams' employment agreement deferred a third of her salary, 90,000 per year, into stock. So effectively, she would make $60,000 a year. Gygax's salary as president was now set at $120,000. Incidentally, it furthermore required her to immediately purchase $50,000 worth of TSR stock upon accepting the agreement, and to buy a further $100,000 worth of stock in the 1986 calendar year. Given TSR's precarious situation, this represented a significant cash infusion, but also a substantial risk to Williams as an investor. Gygax wrote in her offer letter of her commitment to TSR as evidenced by her determination to acquire a substantial holding in the corporation. Though the amount in question fell far short of a controlling interest, Gygax remained cautious about outsider control. Gygax made hiring Williams a high priority. Consider that the board voted him president and CEO on a Friday afternoon, and her offer letter dates to the following Monday. Indeed, he thought highly enough of her that the offer letter concludes, I am placing your name before the board for an election to a directorship. A new infusion of capital could go a long way towards solving one of TSR's most pressing problems. At the March 29th board meeting that had voted Gygax into the presidency, the board also agreed to purchase all of the Bloom family stock, including Bryant's unexercised option for 700 shares minus the strike price, at a valuation of $340.87 per share, for a total of $506,070. No one expected it would come as a lump sum. Various installment plans were considered, paying it out over the course of 4 years or so with accrued interest. That, accompanied by an attractive severance package, reflected a significant improvement on what the Foreman Group had offered the Blooms, and a way of finally securing their exit from the company. But the board of directors no longer controlled TSR's purse. Almost immediately after Gygax took control of TSR, the American National Bank cut TSR's line of credit from the original $10.8 million down to $5 million. Martins would later state, with Gygax in majority control, that the bank perceived a real difficulty in being able to control expenditures and control ultimately their line of credit and collateral. In an attempt to assuage their doubts, Gygax went in to meet with the bank on April 3rd, but he also came with his hat in his hands. TSR needed an additional $500,000 at a minimum to continue operating. Gygax furthermore had to raise with the bank the recent board vote to purchase the Bloom stock. But capital was scarce at the time, and lenders behaved conservatively as the American financial industry began to reel under the throes of the savings and loan crisis that toppled several prominent Midwestern banks. In a letter to Gygax dated April 9th, the American National Bank made it clear that they believed Gygax underestimated just how much TSR owed to its vendors and service providers. The $500,000 in cash for operations that Gygax requested was denied, as the letter explained the bank's interest in advancing funds beyond its lending formulas would in any circumstances be limited to the amount of new cash equity contributed to TSR. Furthermore, on the matter of TSR acquiring the Bloom family stock, the bank deemed such a transaction inappropriate for TSR given its financial condition, and consequently, the bank would not consent to the buyback. This put TSR's board in an increasingly difficult situation. They scheduled a meeting for April 16th at the headquarters of Rexnord, west of Milwaukee in Bishop's Woods, bright and early at 9:15 in the morning, as they would be discussing Lorraine Williams' employee agreement. She arranged to be present, but for only part of the meeting. She introduced herself to the board and listened to some of the discussion about a response to the bank. In a private conference, the board did confirm Williams into her position as Vice President of Administration and grant her a 6-month option to purchase 50 shares at $300. Identical option grants were simultaneously bestowed upon executives of the TSR Games International and Media business, Mike Cook, Andre Mullen, and John Beebe, respectively. The stock grant that Williams received fell far short of the broad investment Gygax had sought. When Gygax raised with the board the possibility of adding a 7th director, that is, Williams, the matter was postponed for further discussion. I got a vote of no confidence, Williams recalled, adding that Gygax told her, "We'll talk about it later." When the Blooms learned at this meeting that the bank had blocked the acquisition of their stock, they once again expressed reluctance about signing any severance agreement with TSR. What happened next is a matter of some dispute. During a recess in the meeting, Gygax met with Kevin and Brian Bloom privately in a second-floor solarium in the Rexnord facility. According to the Blooms, they offered their shares to Gygax, who agreed to purchase them personally with his own funds. Gygax later refuted this claim, but as the discussion happened behind closed doors, it is no simple matter to ascertain the truth of it. The Blooms left the meeting confident that their exit path was clear. 2 days later, they sent a formal notice to TSR of their intent to sell their shares, presumably to Gygax. Then on May 6, they finally signed a severance agreement with TSR. Under it, both brothers would receive a year of pay, $8,333 a month for Brian, $7,500 a month for Kevin. Kevin's reduced share reflected a penalty for subsidizing his sister-in-law Judy Witt's sabbatical. Under a separate settlement that would be signed a few days later, it let the Blooms retain their TSR benefits program and even gave Kevin the right to purchase the company car he used. In return, the agreement secured their continuing support in some of the legal challenges against TSR. Kevin Bloom would be deposed in Rose Estes lawsuit on May 12th. The GB&B Investment Real Estate Partnership, which owned the Torrent building, could not close immediately due to the complexities of the bank's involvement, but the severance agreement promised that TSR Inc. shall use its continuing best efforts to effect a transaction whereby TSR Incorporated acquires all assets and liabilities of the partnership. The Saturday after signing the agreement, Brian and Kevin hosted a retirement party, inviting TSR staff over to Brian's modest home on Miller Road. We have had a lot of good times working with you, the invitation read, but now it is time for us to say goodbye. Come party with us to celebrate new futures. As Vice President of Administration and Chief Operating Officer under Gygax, we might say that William stepped into Kevin's Bloom's old shoes. She ended up performing those tasks, which, as Gygax had once said of Bloom's operational role, constituted the dirty end of the stick. For example, Gygax did not sign TSR's severance agreement with the Konings back on April 8th, even though the blank on the form was labeled E. Gygax, President, TSR Incorporated. The signature above it was Williams. It is perhaps more striking that Gygax would not even sign the Bloom severance agreement on May 6th. Williams executed it in his place as well. Williams would describe Gygax as someone not eager to have the day-to-day management of the company, but what he wanted to do was to be involved in the creative aspect of the company and have someone else do the day-to-day management. Insofar as the creative work involved with game design, Gygax delegated much of that responsibility as well. Gygax effectively split the 2.5% royalty with Zeb Cook and Francois Freudeval. His name would grace the cover, but no one maintained much of a pretense that Gygax actually wrote the text, where we do see Gygax exerting his creative energy at the time is in writing fiction. After frustrating years about being blocked by the gatekeepers of Hollywood from telling his stories, Gygax pivoted back to his original passion. Dragonlance had established TSR as a book publisher, and Random House would handle distribution, so nothing could really stop him from achieving his longtime ambition of becoming a published fantasy author. Gygax asked the editor of Dragon early in April to telegraph that a novel set in Greyhawk called Saga of Old City would be forthcoming late in the year, pleading that he was just too involved with corporate survival at the moment to be able to perform the task. But he did find time to submit a teaser to the 100th issue of Dragon for a story called At Moonset Black Cat Comes, the long-delayed introduction of his character Gord. Back in 1983, Gord the Rogue had been a planned film project for the DDEC, one shelved with the remainder of their plans. Now, thanks to TSR's growing fiction business, the character of Gord found another way to reach the public. Perhaps after his lengthy identity crisis, Gygax had at last started on a path to fulfillment. In the spring, years of harsh cost-cutting measures at TSR finally began to have a salubrious effect. With less than 100 persons on payroll, overhead had lessened to a point where the company's substantial games and publishing business could pay for themselves. After seemingly endless stream of losses, TSR made a small profit for the months of April and May. On June 13th, the salary deferrals imposed the previous December finally ended. The current financial condition of the corporation is still in need of improvement. As Martins dryly put it in a company-wide notice, but because of the hard work and extra efforts you have all put forth during these past 6 months, we are able to make this change. Martins urged everyone to be cost conscious and work as efficiently as possible. He knew well that the company was going to take at least one last hard hit before advancing on the road to recovery. In June, the end of the fiscal year, they needed to register some accounting charges. For that month alone, they took a $2 million loss. The year had been full of punishing financial obstacles. At the bank's behest, Williams and Martins had worked with the consulting service to reorganize TSR's massive unsecured debt to vendors and service providers. Ultimately, they struck a deal where TSR would repay $1.2 million to its minor creditors over the course of 10 months. TSR took a further charge from the ongoing severance obligations the company incurred to part with the Bloom brothers and with Konings. They also had to write off costs related to the failed miniatures business and some losses in the international business. And an additional $1 million went to writing off excess and obsolete inventory product that they now had no hope of selling. The company's accounting firm judged that TSR took a total loss for the 1985 year of roughly $3.8 million, a number so damning it was immediately suppressed. TSR feared to release their audit for the year because their accounting firm would have been required to add an ongoing concern clause to the audit. As Williams put it, such a red flag would have lost us our 60-day terms of credit with our vendors. Without the 60-day terms, we were out of business. The financial crisis was exacerbated by the enormous overhead of the DDEC operation in Hollywood. The books of TSR Incorporated were never cleanly separated, and with Gygax back in the helm of TSR, the two effectively collapsed. The cost of renting the King Vidor Ranch in the Hollywood Hills, around $10,000 a month, was of serious concern to the board, and having been informed that the bank specifically limited the amount of money TSR could advance to DDEC, Gygax still continued the lease. Apparently, the board learned about the lease only when James Huber contacted the rental company. Ultimately, Gygax paid the rent himself. Martins would withhold more than $50,000 from Gygax's royalties from July forward to cover expenses at the house. This did nothing to reassure the board that Gygax would manage the company in a way compatible with their obligations to their creditors. Creditors were not the only uneasy parties dealing with TSR. 2 months after the departure of the Bloom brothers, neither Gygax nor TSR had made any movement to acquire their family's stock option. The Blooms had sent TSR a fresh notice of intent to sell and offer to sell on May 31st, and then another on July 22nd. These notices asserted that TSR's inaction releases these shares from the shareholder agreement, which would permit them to sell them to other shareholders, but they also included a complaint that TSR refused to furnish the Blooms with a shareholder list. This charge was met with silence. On August 15th, the Blooms finally got their answer from board member Jim Huber, which called into question any sales of Brian's unexercised 700 share option and raised again the murky situation of the 200 shares Kevin Bloom had received from his father. Kevin then sent a mailing directly to Williams on August 25th with carbon copies to the TSR board, which expressed his total disbelief that there could be any confusion about the Bloom shareholder position and stressed that their severance packages was accepted based on Gygax's offer to buy the Bloom stock in TSR's stead. When can we expect to receive Gygax's offer? If you had wanted to ask Gygax something on August 25th, you could have gone to Milwaukee, where he was signing autographs at the TSR booth at GenCon that Sunday morning from 10 to noon. Gygax had taken his own advice from last year and scheduled himself prominent appearances on all 4 days of the convention. This was the first year GenCon relocated from the University of Wisconsin at Parkside to the large Milwaukee Convention Center. The character of the event necessarily changed as it transitioned from a university environment where games could be scheduled for intimate classrooms to the cavernous halls of a convention center, with their thundering din dividing up space with curtained avenues bearing names like Dice Drive and Barbarian. One of the big promotional hypes this year was that Gygax was back. One attendee told Alarms and Excursions. This seemed to create a stir among some of the attendees. Frank Menser was on hand to run a tournament based on the Temple of Elemental Evil. Frank Menser was on hand to run a tournament based on Temple of Elemental Evil. An excerpt from the long awaited T2 module. Be the first in your group to play. Though advanced press suggested they hoped to draw 10,000 gamers, maybe even 12,000, early reports suggested attendance did not rise over 6,000. Even an institution as long-standing as GenCon took a hit from such a transition. A few days after GenCon was over, Gygax wrote to Kevin Bloom to flatly deny that he had ever agreed to purchase the Bloom family position. In April, no offer was ever made, as the individuals present in the board meeting will state. He did concede that he promised he would try to find a consortium of individuals willing and able to purchase Bloom held shares at the price promised, in the neighborhood of $3.50 a share. But Gygax observed, I understand you have changed your position, now requiring a price of $500 a share. I must state that such a price is, to the best of my knowledge and belief, excessive and unreasonable. The shareholder agreement basically prevented TSR from acquiring shares at any price above the book value. Gygax would later claim that Williams advised him that they had made some sort of an invalid offer. Don't worry about it. Legal was handling it. Indeed, Huber had already questioned the legality of the proposed sale, as there was no imminent risk that anyone take the Blooms up on this offer. Gygax told them it was virtually impossible. He turned his attention elsewhere. In an analysis of a game of chess, one might deem that a blunder. Not that weightier matters did not demand Gygax's attention at that historical moment. The financial situation more or less hit rock bottom in the first week of September. When TSR exceeded a spending cap and the bank stopped advancing funds, they had lacked a signed agreement since the start of the new year, and the bank demanded a meeting to negotiate a path forward. Although Gygax and Williams were both supposed to attend, with Huber, Gygax had other plans. His cavalier attitude toward those matters further eroded the confidence in the remainder of the board. And Gygax had external worries as well. Patricia Poling continued to press her case against D&D in the court of public opinion, bolstered by the claims of Thomas Radecki, a campaigner against various mass media influences on children. The pair had assembled a list of more than 50 murders or suicide they supposedly linked to D&D. Already at the beginning of the year, there were rumors that 60 Minutes would air an episode about the public outcry against Dungeons and Dragons. As Early as April or May, in fact, it did not surface until this moment of crisis in mid September. It appeared right on the heels of a September 9th article in Newsweek called Kids, the Deadliest Game, which effectively previewed the broadcast story. These two pieces generated the worst public relations week for D&D since the Egbert incident 6 years earlier. Ed Bradley solemnly introduced D&D in the 60 Minutes segment with a proposition that there are a lot of adults who think it has been connected to a number of suicides and murders. Bradley gamely pronounced the name of 8 adolescents whose deaths or murders Poling and Radecki blamed on the game. After a brief profile of TSR, the piece turned its cameras on Gary Gygax wearing an avuncular sweater and TSR spin doctor Dieter Sturm decked out in a suit. Gary Gygax owns the company and invented the game, Bradley explained, before he donned his spectacles to grill the pair of them over the cases tabulated by Poling and Radecki. Sturm delivered a prepared TSR talking point that with 3 or 4 million players, the suicide rates among players are within normal averages for the teenage population. I have yet to see one bit of valid evidence to show this has been anything more than coincidental with a disturbed child. Gygax confirmed, concluding that Poling's crusade was nothing short of a witch hunt. Bradley introduced Radecki as a scientist who teaches in the University of Illinois Medical School, although as recently as August, the director of that medical campus had disavowed Radecki's credentials to the press, reporting that instead Radecki had briefly held an unpaid appointment for some time in 1983, and he has had essentially no contact with students and no role in the College of Medicine. Since then, on camera, an excited Radecki told Ed Bradley that of 28 cases he had studied of deaths linked in D&D, in some of them, those it was clearly the decisive element, and in others merely a major element, insisting it was not coincidence. Radecki also related with a straight face an account of parents who witnessed their child summon a demon into his room before he killed himself. Through the magic of television, Gygax and Poling engaged in a back-and-forth dispute. Gygax in one shot insisted D&D was make-believe. The next shot cut to Poling, who countered that it is not. There is no board. It is role-playing, which is typically used for behavior modif. What? Those Newsweek and 60 Minutes stories open the gates to more of the same. On September 20th, Poling appeared in Connecticut at Putnam High School for a 500-person information session about D&D. Following the Board of Education's unanimous decision not to ban the game despite a local petition, she was joined there by William Deere still hawking his book, The Dungeon Master, and eagerly warning about the dangers of D&D. Ever one for a dramatic touch, Deere played a cassette tape he had recorded during the Egbert investigation of an interview with a young fan in the throes of D&D addiction. The spate of the sensational publicity was a very unwelcome distraction. at a critical time for the fate of TSR. It could not have steadied the nerves of creditors concerned about the repayment of TSR's loans. The bank at this point demanded additional collateral to continue TSR's line of credit. Beyond a claim on the facilities on Sheridan Spring Road, they requested trademarks and service marks, including those for Gencon and Greyhawk. Gygax curtly informed TSR that it did not own those trademarks. In an October 4th memo to the legal department, Gygax insisted that any work bearing my name as creator or co-creator is to be done under my copyright, not of TSR, and that moreover, trademarks created by me are likewise my sole and exclusive property. No doubt there was some sensitivity about Greyhawk in particular, as Gygax's forthcoming novel in that setting, called Saga of Old City, would prominently feature the Greyhawk adventure's trade dress. Gygax thus made an ultimatum. All material is submitted only under this express consideration. Unless TSR agrees to this consideration, you may not publish my work. By now, the remainder of the board had come to believe Gygax's financial interest in his creative activities for the company conflicted with his responsibilities as its chief executive, and this had to be resolved before TSR could move forward. Lorraine Williams started to intervene on Monday, October 7th, while Gygax was out of town to address the Washington School of Psychiatry. Followed by 3 days of meetings with publishers in New York, everything had to be carefully choreographed from this point forward. She called Kevin Bloom and asked if they could meet soon, somewhere off TSR premises, and discovered he was eager to get together that very day. Brian was easily persuaded to join them. She secured a conference room at the Hilton Hotel by Lake Geneva, where she had and the Bloom brothers could meet at 7 that evening, bringing with her both Martins and a draft agreement to purchase the family stock. Then the day after, Williams had lunch with Kevin at Fazio's, where she set the wheels in motion by handing over a check made out to Brian for $70,000 to cover the exercise of Bloom's stock option, the twin of the one Gygax had exercised in March. Right after that lunch, the Blooms dispatched a notice to TSR of their intent to sell all the 990 shares of TSR Incorporated held by the undersigned and 700 shares to be obtained by Brian Bloom upon the exercise of his option to purchase such shares for $350 a share. A total of $591,500. The letter stipulated a 10-day clock for the process. If and when TSR refused to buy the shares, any other shareholders then had 10 days to write Bloom to exercise their option to purchase his stock. By not doing so, the shareholders collectively would be expressing their waiver of option to purchase or inability to purchase those shares. The remaining shareholders in the corporation at this point are easily named. There were the immediate members of the Gygax family: Gary, his estranged wife Mary, their son Ernie, and daughter Elise. Dave Wesley held the one share he had gotten from Dave Arneson. And Heritage Models, though now defunct, was still listed as the owner of 3 shares, granted by Arneson in the TSR ledgers. Will Niebling and his wife Shar had 10 shares. A handful of current employees still held a few shares each. Frank Mentzer, Harold Johnson, Kathy Lynch, and Don Turnbull, a gamer named Mark Claymaster, had long ago acquired a single share. The profit-sharing plan also commanded close to 10% of the company's stock. At this point, shares that could be voted by its trustees, effectively the company's president and its corporate secretary. And while Williams could arrange to become a shareholder herself, thanks to the option the board had granted her in April, she elected to say that for the last possible minute to not give away her plan. So, it transpired that Williams had resolved to acquire control of TSR. Why? Shortly after she came on board, the relationship between Gygax and Williams began to sour. The financial situation in the company remained dire, and Williams did not approve of TSR's handling of the Bloom family situation. If she was going to invest further in TSR, it would be to empower her and to make real changes in the way the company was operating. Therefore, in October 1985, she saw no need to give Gygax any advance notice of her pending deal with the Blooms. Gygax and I were not talking very much during that time because we had very fundamental differences, she would remark. Furthermore, informing Gygax that she intended to purchase the Bloom family shares would be, as she put it, an invitation for him to get in and just try to screw it up and to once again try to thwart the ability of the Blooms to sell their stock and to get out and go about their lives. Williams could count on the support of Martins, who held on to the check that shortly came in from Brian Bloom for the exercise of his 700 share option. Late in the day on October 10th, Martins, in his capacity as treasurer and secretary, sent a letter to all TSR Incorporated shareholders and the board of directors, first acknowledging receipt of the Bloom's intent to sell, and second announcing that TSR would not buy the stock, thus opening the door to other shareholders to purchase them. In fact, Martins explained that it would literally be illegal for TSR to purchase them, as a Wisconsin statute forbid an acquisition that would exceed unreserved and unrestricted capital. And at that very moment, TSR stood on the verge of bankruptcy. Gygax had returned to the office that Thursday and must have seen the notice and the immediate refusal from Martins, but Gygax had been receiving intent to sell notices for months now, many pressuring him to fill the promise they claim he made. Although the broom's price had come down quite a bit, the position of TSR at the time was so precarious that anyone would hesitate before investing $500,000. Maybe the blooms would go lower still. October 11th was a Friday, and then there was the weekend. No one expressed interest in buying the Bloom shares. At the 10-day work clock wound toward a close, Williams got ready. Before she could buy the shares from the Blooms, she needed to become a shareholder herself, or it would be in potential violation of the transfer provisions for the shareholder agreement. On October 16th, Williams wrote a check to TSR for $15,000 to exercise the option for 50 shares the board had granted her in April. Exactly 6 months after she had received the option and the very day it would expire, she delivered the check to Martins by hand and sweetly asked, "In how many seconds am I going to get my certificate?" She and Martins had a strong relationship, and little jokes like that were typical of their exchanges. Martins decided to tease her a little bit by replying, "If you ask for it too fast, it might be really slow." He had not yet issued Bloom's certificate. There were some technical problems clearing William's $70,000 check to Bloom, so Martins could not deposit Bloom's check until those resolved, well past the point of no return. Executing a plan that required punctuality, William suggested impatiently, "Well, I hope you don't hold mine for a couple of weeks." Seeing the expression on her face, Martins ventured, "I think I'll get up and do it." Her certificate was signed by Martins in his capacity as board secretary, and Williams signed for the slot marked president, as she had many times before when wielding the dirty end of the stick for severance agreements and similar functions. The pair would sign another certificate 2 days later, on Friday, October 18th. This one in the amount of 700 shares assigned to Brian Bloom for his option exercise. Lorraine met with the Blooms for lunch at the Lake Lawn Lodge, at a bit of remove from the office, in nearby Delavan, where Kevin resided, along with Martins and an attorney who would oversee the escrow agreement they were about to sign. Brian dutifully endorsed all his shares to Williams and deposited them into the escrow along with his wife's. Kevin and his wife would do the same, though because of the controversy surrounding 200 of their shares, Melvin Bloom was also party to the agreement. Kevin executed it on his father's behalf after securing permission over the telephone. Under the terms of the escrow on the last day of 1986, and each December 31st thereafter for the following 4 years, Williams would deposit $140,300 plus interest calculated at 13% in exchange for those shares. With that, Williams secured the Bloom family stake in TSR. Another weekend passed. Then on Monday, Martins and Williams would sign yet another fateful stock certificate, number 107, which has signed all 1,690 Bloom family shares to Williams. This made her the majority shareholder of the company. While the past day's events were playing out, Gygax's fiancée Gail Carpenter's mother passed away, and the pair of them drove to Kentucky for the funeral. Gygax did not return until late in the evening of October 20th. Upon his return, Gygax continued to feud over royalties, trademarks, and copyrights. He seemed to believe that with his interest in the company, he could dictate terms, even reshaping if necessary. On October 21st, he sent a memo with the following threat. After consideration, I am convinced it is in the best interest of TSR and its shareholders to ask that the board be reduced to 3 directors. Those directors who remained would receive no compensation. At the time, directors received $12,000 a year and a further $500 for each meeting they attended. Gygax intended to implement these measures as of the next shareholder meeting, coming up on November 12th. The board requested a meeting the following day. Gygax came ready for a fight, but was woefully unprepared for what was to come. On the evening of October 22nd, 1985, at the Sheridan Springs office, when Martins began to spill the beans, Gygax must have immediately recognized that the exercise of the Bloom option had diluted his own stake below half of the outstanding stock in the company. But Martins did not volunteer who would control these newly issued shares. Since these events played out in real time, Gygax had little opportunity to reflect. Wesley Sommer formally requested that Gygax tender his resignation. No doubt still grappling with his new circumstances, he refused. Sommer proposed then the following to the TSR board for a vote: resolve that, in the best interest of the corporation, Gygax be terminated as president and chairman, and that Gygax and TSR negotiate and enter into an agreement whereby Gygax would continue to do creative work, and the company continue to utilize his creative talent. This last clause no doubt related to the royalty issue previously under discussion. James Huber seconded the motion. The motion passed with 3 directors in favor, 1 opposed, and 1 abstaining. While this stunning turn of events may seem momentous enough for one meeting, the board then turned its attention to the newly created vacancies in senior management. Immediately, the Blooms put forward Sommer to succeed Gygax. This passed easily, but then Sommer advanced another proposition that Lorraine Williams should replace Gygax as interim president and CEO of TSR. Blindsided, Gygax pushed back. Williams had only been there 6 months and had no background in games, but Sommer championed Williams on the ground that she previously had acted as president in Gygax's absence and would transition to the role with the least disruption to the company. Gygax counter-proposed bestowing the position on Willard Martins, who, in addition to acting secretary for the board, was finance vice president of TSR, but Martins demurred, ostensibly due to his other responsibilities. After some short discussion, the board approved the motion to appoint Lorraine Williams president and CEO, overriding Gygax's strenuous objections. Surely Gygax would not have bothered to contest the appointment had he understood the true situation. The critical piece of information everyone else in the room was privy to that he lacked. Gygax had missed the warning signs. He overlooked how immediately prior to the board meeting, several of the other directors, including Sommer, Huber and Kevin Bloom had congregated in Williams' office. In that private conference, those parties agreed not to reveal the extent of the changes in the shareholder positions to Gygax. It could not have been hard to persuade the board, who had tired of Gygax's posturing over his rights and compensation, that this was the prudent path. On October 22nd, Gygax walked into an ambush, ignorant of Williams' newfound stake in TSR. He could only watch in amazement as the board stripped him of his job and appointed Williams his successor. As a final action of the meeting, the board moved to grant Gygax a severance package consistent with what has been done in the past, presumably a reference to the package extended to the Blooms. Kevin Bloom seconded this motion. The severance package was approved by the board. And the meeting adjourned at the 7:15. In only 90 minutes, Gygax, utterly baffled, watched control of TSR transfer to an outsider, a non-gamer, someone who had no connection to D&D. After the board meeting, but before he made his way out of the building, Gygax wrote a note in Martin's office requesting a current list of TSR shareholders. As Gygax was no longer an employee and no longer chairman of the board, Martins referred his request to Jim Huber. Since the policy of the company precluded distributing that list unless it was covered by a protective order in connection with litigation, as the Blooms had discovered not long ago, Gygax was totally in the dark as to what had just happened. Word of these cataclysmic events immediately spread through the game community, but at first blush, no one discerned that Williams was behind it. Likely thanks to Wesley's single share of stock, word had already reached Arneson in his apartment near Golden Gate Park in San Francisco by October 24th. But like Gygax, he thought the Blooms were behind it. Arneson wrote to Dave McGarry, biggest news around here is that Gary has been removed from being president at TSR, and in all likelihood next month's shareholder meeting will see the Blooms back in the saddle again. Disaster, I am told, will shortly follow, as the bank will call the note or the company will be run into the ground. For the first time in a long while, Arneson had some personal stake in TSR's roadmap. Needless to say, my planned module series is probably deader than the proverbial doornail. I am told that such is not the case. I will have to wait to see. A Blackmore module series and the income it promised was of particular interest to him, as the 1981 settlement agreement had run its course, and Arneson's royalty payments would now dry up. Rumors in the hobby fanzine suggested that the old offices of Adventure Games in Twin Cities had been padlocked by creditors. In advance of the shareholder meeting scheduled for the week of November 12th, Gygax took forceful but ultimately futile steps to undo the damage, attempting a bit of retroactive continuity, as gamers would say. He felt the best path was simply to exercise his rights under the shareholder agreement by sending Brian Bloom on November 5th an unsolicited cashier's check for $113,750 as a 50% down payment to secure 650 of the Bloom family shares. The $350 per share price was perhaps high under the circumstances, as Gygax would remark a few days later, but certainly worth paying for control of the corporation. This move complied with the terms of the shareholder agreement, as there was no precedent for any 10-day clock in that document. It allows the company 30 days to purchase offered shares, and then states that if another shareholder buys them, then one half of the purchase price shall be paid in cash within 90 days. Hence, Gygax's presumptuous checks simply ignored the possibility that the shares were already spoken for. Those 650 shares would have restored control of TSR to Gygax by a comfortable margin. But from the moment the Blooms had signed their agreement with Williams, their shares resided in escrow, so Brian was in no position to accept such an offer. As he somewhat cryptically explained to Gygax over the phone. Ironically, had the board not dispensed with the pro rata clause of the stock agreement back in March to clear the way from the Foreman Gill, Gygax could have relied on that, as it would have permitted Williams to purchase only a number of shares proportionate to her own holdings, which could amount no more than 50 shares. With such a poison pill, a hostile takeover is virtually impossible. Without it, an outsider assuming control was all too plausible. Gygax's check was not the only challenge to Williams' transaction. Don Pernbull, a shareholder loyal to Gygax, sent a letter on October 28th to Brian Bloom that made its gradual way overseas from Britain, stating that he had not received the intent to sell notice until well after the 10-day clock had expired, and politely asked if Brian and Kevin would care to reset the clock until mid-November to give him time to consider it. A similar notice came registered from Ernie Gygax, who still resided in Hollywood. On November 11th, the day before the shareholder meeting, the situation began to become clear. Gygax spoke to Kevin that morning about the mysterious agreement that barred him from acquiring the Bloom family stake, and while Kevin immediately proposed to drive into Lake Geneva to share a company with Gygax, he had to apologize when his legal counsel barred that. "I'm sorry too," Gygax replied, and then took the matter to the courts, demanding an emergency restraining order against the Blooms, Williams, Martins, the escrow attorney, and TSR itself to effectively prevent any stock transfer until the dispute could be resolved. In his desperation, at around 5 o'clock in the afternoon, Gygax drove over to Brian Bloom's house and hand-delivered a supplement to his earlier offer, which promised he was ready, willing, and able to purchase as many shares as necessary to regain control of the company, even if that meant all of them. Subpoenas went out the next morning, and the shareholder meeting was indefinitely postponed. A judge could not review the matter until November 14th. In his initial pleading, Gygax's attorney summed up the circumstances as he saw them. The situation, notwithstanding the hyper-technical arguments, is a very simple one. It's a man who is the co-founder and a large shareholder in this company who had clear rights under a shareholder agreement to control in the events the Bloom's interests decided to sell out. They did so decide. He exercised his right, and now comes a newcomer to the company with a deal with the Blooms and is attempting to seize control and may de facto, subject to the power of the court, have already done so. Based on a couple of days of investigation, the court agreed that the matter was looking into, and a temporary injunction was put in place barring TSR from allowing share transfers until the legal situation could be resolved. The resulting battle stretched into the second half of 1986, during which time Williams remained president and Gygax was now merely a shareholder and outside director. The court reviewed TSR's 1985 upheavals and concluded that the Blooms had satisfied the obligations of the agreement by providing TSR and Gygax personally with ample notice of their intention to sell, as well as numerous opportunities to purchase their shares. When the bank constrained TSR from purchasing Bloom stock, the remaining shareholders had an option to buy the shares, as the agreement stipulates, but Gygax sat on his rights, the court decided. When no one stepped forward, the Blooms were thereafter free to sell their stock to anyone they chose at any price. Their subsequent sale to Williams did not violate the shareholders' agreement. The court also considered the question of whether Gygax had promised to buy the Bloom family position in the solarium at Rexnord on April 16th. and finally ruled on the basis of testimony from the independent board members that Gygax had agreed to buy their stock, and the Blooms and Gygax reported that commitment to the other directors. The court upheld the sale to Williams, lifting all injunctions on August 28, 1986. Faced with the prospect of holding a minority stake in TSR, run by Williams, Gygax elected to walk away from the company, resigning all positions in October 1986 and selling his shares to Williams. As he put it in a farewell note to Dragon, the shape and direction of the Dungeons & Dragons game system or that of the AD&D system are now entirely in the hands of others. At the bitter end, his parting shot still maintained that the advanced system was not the same game as the original, but the long battle he had fought to retain control of Dungeons & Dragons against a succession of challengers had ended. Turn results for 1985. Revenue $24 million. Losses $3.8 million. Employees 96. Stock valuation $300. GenCon attendance versus Origins 6,000 versus question mark. Players eliminated Gary Gygax. Epilogue. Endgame. Gygax thus found himself at the end of 1986 in the same position Arneson had a decade earlier, on the outside of Dungeons & Dragons looking in. Should we be astonished to find Gygax following in Arneson's footsteps with such fidelity that he endorsed a new edition of the city-state of the Invincible Overlord, now published at Mayfair, not the Judges Guild, and that TSR had to sue over it? Like Arneson, Gygax quickly formed his own games company, though his efforts tread too close to D&D intellectual property, resulting in further litigation. And ultimately a lucrative settlement for Gygax that rid TSR of his interference. But despite his best efforts, Gygax, like Arneson, never came close to having another D&D. Gygax had spent so long shaping the history of TSR while he ran it, he was hardly going to stop when he left, or ignore his final chapter, because Gygax's years of TSR ended in disappointment. The narrative of TSR he now told was a tragedy. His new character was the hero, betrayed by his perfidious business partners. In his 1986 farewell piece in Dragon, he had said nothing about his ouster from TSR apart that the board of directors of the corporation saw fit to remove me as the company's president and chairman of the board. But in the fall of 1988, he opened up an essay called "A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Boardroom" for a fall gaming magazine called The Familiar. With just 2 years' worth of dust settled on the lawsuit that severed him from TSR, Gygax had enough self-awareness to recognize he cannot reflect on his ouster dispassionately. Is there bitterness, he asked himself? Could such be avoided considering the conditions? But that bitterness took its toll on the fidelity of his account. In claims about TSR's finances like "I began to see an inkling of the trouble in the fall of 1984, which neglects the catastrophic situation TSR found itself in after its overextension." during which Gygax as president had no small inkling of trouble when the bank demanded they lay off a third of TSR's workforce after 2 years of substantial declines in core sales. His timeline of events laid all the blame at the feet of the Bloom family, casting himself a victim to their financial indiscipline and later, when they sold their shares to Williams, of their vengeance. Gygax ultimately turned out to be a man who had disinterest and sometimes bordering on contempt for running a business, but who could not bring himself to relinquish it either. This is not a desirable quality in a chief executive. He viewed the job as a sacrifice, something he had never sought, but instead had thrust upon him. He discharged its duties well enough when TSR remained at a hobby level, but once it grew beyond a low-level character sort of company, he found the controls of its apparatus maddening and turned his attention elsewhere. While Gygax conceded that he was recording only his impressions, he felt confident with added years will come better perspective. Indeed, his bitterness intensified over time as his new ventures languished, making it harder to align historical facts with later claims. An interview with Gygax that appeared in the Gamer in 1992 thus began with a warning that if Gygax says it, someone will disagree, contradict, or deride. By that point, Gygax's story about the Blooms had drastically magnified their malfeasance. For instance, he claimed there were still 600 on payroll and 100 were related by marriage or blood to the Blooms. Neither of those figures could stand even a cursory fact check. Little about the creator of the role playing game is straightforward or undisputed, including his status as the creator of the role playing game. As time passed and the stature of D&D in popular culture solidified, the question of who has the right to claim that status is overshadowed by any disputes about the final troubles of TSR in the mid 80s. The article quotes Gygax asserting, D&D, I wrote every word of that. Even my co-author admits that. But the gamer had access to Arneson as well, and it's summarized, Arneson admits nothing of the kind, but won't say much because of a court settlement. By saying little, Arneson could hint that a great secret, one quite unfavorable to Gygax, had been suppressed by legal measures. Yet back in April 81, when the ink of their settlement was barely dry, Arneson did not feel any impediment to detailing Gygax's part in the authoring of the original game in words like, at the time, they had a lot more spare time than I did. They had a lot of ideas, so they came up with their own version of the rules. They sent theirs to us and we fooled around with them for a while. Arneson's later reticence masked his own ambivalence towards producing productizing D&D in 1973, then working at TSR in 1975, both of which Gygax was at some pains to overcome. It might not be unfair to say that Arneson only became energized about the prospects of D&D when he felt it was something taken away from him when there was a great war to wage. Weaponized rhetoric, which was originally forged during the battle for Dungeons and Dragons in the first decade of its existence, lay strewn throughout the historical record like unexploded ordnance. The testimony of the game's creators naturally formed the basis for the first attempts to compile an origin story of D&D. It has led many people, myself included, on wild goose chases, trying to substantiate later claims that turn out to be will-o-wisps born of the conflict. These statements were not engineered impartially. It was the primary aim of this book to show, to the extent possible, the baseline events that all this rhetoric has obscured. In the 1970s, Gygax and Arneson collaborated without any notion of what they would make or what it could mean for their lives or legacies. From the moment the game enjoyed even a modest success, they were always scrambling to keep up, position themselves and each other as they struggled to understand how their unexpected windfall had come to pass and how to hold on to it. Their relationship as hobbyist collaborators could not survive the transition to a workplace, let alone an industry. Nor ultimately could Gygax's partnership with his fellow hobbyist Brian Bloom when it became clear that business beyond a certain level could not be pursued like an adventure. As Gygax directed the product's marketing over its first decade, it is unsurprising that his name is more associated with the game of D&D than any other. Or maybe the name Gygax is just the more memorable one. A history like this one can never resolve on the uncertainties around the story. Some are ambiguities built into the history itself. Did the 1975 contract language about the set of game rules or the game entitled Dungeons and Dragons apply to the entirety of the Holmes Basic set or to revisions like the advanced game? This question has no definitive answer. The legal language was written before anyone imagined such derivative works might someday exist, and yet the harder you look at the circumstances surrounding Gygax's ouster from TSR in 1985, the less easy it is to say who was in the right. Even questions that seem straightforward, like whether Arneson quit his job or was terminated, turn out to be matters that do admit tidy resolution. But the nuance of these circumstances does not prevent us from understanding what happened, provided we can accept its unresolvability and the role it played in setting the parameters of the battle for D&D. Real life is messy. Unlike the alluring narratives we spin as we try to make sense of it all, real people are messier than the characters they adopt for themselves or project into each other. In their lifetimes, Gygax and Arneson never saw D&D again regain the pinnacle of success it had enjoyed. Lorraine Williams ran TSR for a decade or so, about as long as Gygax had, largely profiting from the strategies on display at GenCon in 1984, campaign settings like Dragonlance and the Forgotten Realms. She still had to manage the fallout of the previous decade, like the 1.4 million the courts determined TSR had to pay Will Niebling for wrongly invalidating his stock option. Gygax was cleared of any personal culpability, but the Blooms were fined $50,000 in punitive damages. Under her tenure, GenCon and Origins would finally be held jointly in 1988, but toward the end of the 90s, TSR once again fell on hard times. The industry had begun to change. While the second edition Player's Handbook outsold the D&D computer adaptation Pool of Radiance in 1989, by the time Baldur's Gate came around in 1997, that would sell 10 times more copies than a hardcover D&D manual. Looking at sales alone, it seemed the world had passed D&D by. After Williams sold the struggling TSR to Wizards of the Coast, Wizards founder Peter Addison made it a priority to mend the rift in the industry and invited both Gygax and Arneson to help unveil the third edition of D&D in 2000. He also promptly did away with the conceit that there existed some separate, advanced version of D&D. It was an era where Gygax would make a cameo appearance on Futurama, and Arneson would appear as a wizard in the Dungeons & Dragons live-action film. Although a community of retro gamers remained dedicated to the original game, for most it was an object of nostalgia, but the flagships of fantasy gaming in the 2000s, computer games like World of Warcraft, knew their profound debt to D&D. When Gygax passed away, the makers of that game made a public statement that D&D was an inspiration to us in many ways and helped spark our passion for creating games of our own. They even added a little flavor text to the game invoking the name of Gygax. Throughout the last decade of his life, the ever-gregarious Gygax dedicated considerable time to online forums, answering all manner of questions, and could still be found in Lake Geneva, running games at smaller shows up till the end. Arneson taught game design at a Florida university, remained a more reclusive figure. Neither would live to see an era where GenCon, which now takes place in Indianapolis, regularly draws more than 60,000 attendees. A spike in attendance coincided with the development of the 5th edition in D&D and a huge resurgence of interest in tabletop games. Back in 1980, a reporter who asked if D&D was only a passing fad learned that Gygax and Bloom think not. D&D, they say, will last 50 years or more. As unlikely as it was in the 1970s that this esoteric offshoot of the wargaming hobby might become a pop culture phenomenon, it is just as unlikely that in 2021 the game would be more popular than ever. As a new generation grows up playing the game, it may be that the true impact of Dungeons & Dragons has yet to be felt. So that will conclude Game Wizards. I'm not really sure what I have planned to read next. I may or may not start it tomorrow, whatever it is. But that is all for tonight.